Oh man, there it goes again. I just spent 25 minutes getting the transition fade set up for the theme to smoothly transition into my camera. And my camera's losing focus again. God, I am such a lazy cheapskate with my setup. I spent 25 minutes doing this. I got it working perfectly. I made like 6 practice recordings to time exactly when that theme should transition in. And then I finally go to really record the serious take of it, and it just, for some reason, just cuts. Welcome to a Discourse About Nothing, the only philosophy podcast where I struggle with timing a theme song because I don't want to edit a video or actually edit audio. I just want to hit the record button and rant. This is going to be the last video about icons I make. I have wasted, I feel, a lot of time contemplating this and looking at the online debates. And I think it's important to do that. It was important for me to work some of this out in my own head because I haven't really changed my mind, but my ideas were not crystallized on some of these topics. And I've put out a few videos already, but I want to put out a video from a different perspective that I have not seen anybody really put out yet. This is going to be a video about direct arguments for or against icons. I've mentioned in my last few blog posts and videos that I find the historical approach that people like Gavin Ortlund and even people that I agree with on the Catholic or Orthodox side of things take to try to show the fathers agreed with icons, the fathers didn't agree with icons. I find that overall weak, and it just completely overlooks direct philosophical arguments, which is how some of the fathers, like St. John of Damascus, argued for icons, was not just by appealing to other fathers, but was by arguing philosophically and theologically, not just historically, not just doing a survey of historical theology. So I want to give you some arguments that I'm convinced by for icon veneration, and make a couple of interesting notes. Now, before I begin, let me put things this way. For some reason, and I know why, but for some reason, without getting into exactly why, our culture, even Christians, have lost faith in the ability of reason to establish theological or philosophical speculative conclusions. We have lost the ability to take seriously that human reason can reach a conclusion about metaphysics or about theology or about God that's actually true. And it's not hard to see why. After the post-Enlightenment, when you have the Kantian, I'm going to call it the Kantian crisis in philosophy, that essentially undermined the mind's ability to know metaphysical reality in and of itself, not just conditioned through human faculties and concepts. When that happened, people lost faith in metaphysics. Kant undercut all of metaphysics, and we never really recovered. Now, parts of philosophy that I'm not versed in, like Hegel, respond to Kant, and 18th to 19th century British philosophy responds to Kant, and there are supposedly some pretty good responses to sort of Kant's skepticism, which he calls transcendental idealism. But I am not versed in that, so I'm not going to get into it. I myself kind of take a sort of pragmatist approach to these sorts of things, and I take a somewhat pragmatist Kantian approach to metaphysics. But that's a topic for another day. But the point is, after Kant, a lot of us, even Christians who, their entire belief system seems to rely on metaphysics and speculative theology, lost faith in the ability of reason to really navigate these topics. And what we see manifesting right now in the Christian YouTube sphere is that, let's just take the debate about icons. Again, the entire thing has been, look, the fathers disagreed with it, or look, this council was wrong. It's a historical theological approach, which I'm not saying is bad, but that's only one kind of theological reasoning. There are more direct theological arguments and philosophical arguments. David Bentley Hart in Tradition and Apocalypse makes a really good point that kind of opened my eyes to this. I know I quote David Bentley Hart a lot. It's because I think he's brilliant and the best living Christian thinker, frankly, or at least philosopher. He makes a point that, look, a lot of people get very upset about Nicaea, the possibility that in Nicaea the Arians actually had the more popular position, or at the very least that Nicene theology, Trinitarian theology, was not the established in the early fathers. Well, then it was just an innovation. And they get very worried because they have stuff like the Da Vinci Code in the back of their mind. Well, the Trinity was just invented. It's a conspiracy or something like that. Why should we privilege Nicene theology over Arianism or semi-Arianism or other types of Trinitarian but not exactly Nicene metaphysics of the Trinity? If we show I guess the fear is that if we show that historically this isn't the only position or the original position of Christianity that the apostles taught, then how do we know it's right? Then it's just as good as anything else. And the church just arbitrarily in Nicaea and Constantinople councils, the church just arbitrarily decided on that. If I can't show that it's the original position, it's the position that's continuous, that everybody always agreed on. It was just some freaks and weirdos called the Arians who were dissenting. But he just, look, no, that's not even how the fathers argue for it. That's not how the Cappadocian fathers argued for Nicene theology. They argued that the only way for God to really fully unify humanity and creation with himself was really fully becoming incarnate. And that means that God himself has to actually become incarnate. God himself has to be the one unifying us with him. Or else there's always going to be a gap. Any sort of non-Nicene theology that doesn't say Christ, who is the unifier, right, of God and man, and of creation and God, Christ who's the unifier, any theology that says Christ is not actually fully God, there's always going to be a gap between God and creation. Yeah, we're going to get closer, but there's always going to be a gap. We're not actually going to be unified with God. But in the incarnation, there's this intimate, there goes my camera, there's this intimate unification of God and man. Much more intimate than an Arian can. And if the entire function of the church, if the entire function of Christ's dying is to unify God with man, is to make man into gods and unify God and man, then isn't the Nicene theology more faithful to that function? That's a direct argument. That argument goes through and is pretty convincing whether or not all of the earlier fathers believed this. Whether or not it was Nicene theology was really the original authoritative position. So our historical theology, our seeing a great diversity of views, should not necessarily undercut our confidence in a position. We need to look at actual philosophical and theological arguments, and it's really only because we've lost faith in that we get so scared that if we can't show historical continuity between everything, that we throw everything away. It's a sort of skepticism, right? So what I want to do is I want to apply that to icons. And let me just start by giving a direct definition of icons. I'm going to go to St. Philaret of Moscow's longer catechism. He was a metropolitan. I'm going to open my notes because I don't know the top of my head. Metropolitan of Moscow from 1821 to 1867. This catechism was written in 1823. Again, in the Orthodox Church, we do not have a papal teaching office. We do not have infallible, universally binding things other than the 7 councils. And it's complicated, right? We don't have an institutional unity like the Catholics do. So this is not necessarily an perfectly authoritative, infallible document, but it is very influential, and it does a really good job from a high authority in the Orthodox Church showing what the Orthodox mean by icon veneration and what it is. And so I'm going to take it as that. And this is what I was taught when I converted. This is what I see in our churches. And I'm going to add a couple points to it. And I am pretty much 100% confident that I will be able to explain what the Orthodox Church means by icon veneration, because it's not that complicated, okay? So here is a definition. I'm going to read directly from this that you can see on your screen. On the second commandment, what is a graven image as spoken of in the second commandment? The commandment itself explains that a graven image or idol is a likeness of some creature in heaven or earth or in the waters, which men bow down to and serve instead of God their maker. What is forbidden by the second commandment? We are forbidden to bow down to graven images or idols as to supposed deities or as to likenesses of false gods. Okay, just a quick point. What this is saying, and I think this is dead on, is that idolatry is bowing down to false gods, whether they exist or not, but to lesser gods and giving them worship when that's only for God. Okay? And idols are bowing down to, fabricated representations, whether that be statues, paintings, some sort of talisman. Bowing down and either treating them themselves as God or venerating a false or lesser deity through them. So idolatry is not just a matter of bowing to an object. Idolatry is a matter of what are you intending and where's your worship going? Right? Is it going to God, who's the only one we should worship, or not? So are we not hereby forbidden to have any sacred representations whatsoever? By no means. This very plainly appears from hence that the same Moses, through whom God gave the commandment against graven images, received at the same time from God an order to place in the tabernacle or movable temple of the Israelites sacred representations of cherubim in gold, and to place them too in that inner part of the temple to which the people turned for the worship of God. That is something St. John of Damascus notes and a bunch of other fathers note. Look, the prohibition against idols is not iconoclastic in the strong sense, right? The question that we should be debating is whether we are allowed to venerate icons and sacred art or not. The debate nowadays, and the rightful debate, is not between should we have any images, should we have sacred images. No, the debate is between one side who says you can have sacred images and images of holy things, but you can't venerate them. And the other side that says you can have them and you can venerate them. That's the debate, okay? Why is this example worthy of remark for the Orthodox Christian Church? Because it illustrates the use of holy icons. What is an icon? The word is Greek and means an image or representation. In the Orthodox Church, this name designates sacred representations of our Lord Jesus Christ, God incarnate, his Immaculate Mother, and his saints. They're leaving out a word there, and I'm not sure if it's just a translation thing, but icons are typically taken as participatory or participations in the subject or in the divine. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But notice the link between imaging, representing, and participation. Those are all related concepts, and I want to get into that. But just hold on. Is the use of holy icons agreeable to the second commandment? It would then and then only be otherwise, if anyone were to make gods of them. But it is not in the least contrary to this commandment to honor icons as sacred representations, and to use them for religious remembrance of God's works and of his saints. Remembrance. Representation, remembrance. Keep those in mind. For one thus use icons are books written with the forms of persons and things instead of letters. That is essentially saying, look, an icon is kind of like a book, but instead of using written language to represent, to describe, to help us remember and imagine, to help connect us to the subject of what the sign is, right? What the letters point to, what the image represents, right? When we use icons like this, it's kind of like a book. It's fundamentally the same sort of relationship. It's saying you have a sign, right? A symbol, and the thing signified, represented, described, pointed to, okay, in some way. Book does that through written language, and image does that through, a visual vocabulary, if you will. What disposition of the mind should we have when we reverence icons? While we look on them with our eyes, we should mentally look to God and to the saints who are represented on them. Okay. Keep that in mind. This, weighty document of the Eastern Church says, here's what veneration is. You look on a sacred image with your eyes. And while you do that, you mentally look to God and the saints who are represented on them. The icon is a representation. The icon represents or signifies a holy subject, a sacred subject. And when you look at them, your mind is carried to the thing signified, and you venerate that thing through the image, through the tangible thing. Not as if necessarily there is some mechanism to where I'm going to deposit my veneration. I'm going to deposit my, let's say it's an attitude of gratitude. Let's say I look at an image of Christ on the cross and I feel grateful, right, for that image. It is not saying that my attitude of gratitude, I deposit it into the icon, and like some sort of middleman, the icon delivers it to God. Okay? Delivers it to Christ himself. As if it's some sort of, mechanism or something. What would it even mean to deposit gratitude? I don't know. But that's how a lot of people talk about icons, right? When we say, the classic way to put this is that the Seventh Council uses is that the honor given to the image transfers to the subject represented. Wow, it's still really not focusing. Come on. Gavin Ortlund, again, I don't want to keep picking on him, but he continually tries to cast doubt on that relationship, but he talks about it as if the icon is a middleman, that it somehow magically transfers to the subject. That's not how it works. It's a mental act of veneration to God. You're just using the icon through your senses. So I hope that makes sense on what icon veneration is. Okay? The question is that proper? Now, I think just by looking at the definition and attempting to practice it, you will see that icon veneration is not idolatry, and it is just an ordinary act of worshiping God or venerating his saints. So the question that arises now is venerating saints okay? And is venerating an image of, let's say, Christ okay? Is it just in general okay? I think just from the definition, again, you see that at least when it's God, seeing an image of God and then mentally, so having your eyes fixed on an image of God and then mentally intending to worship God, that is permissible. You are not worshiping the thing. So the question is the status of the saints, whether we should venerate them at all, whether we should bow to them and greet them with respect, whatever, whether that's okay. And the other one is, if you see an image of Christ, is it okay to worship Christ through that image in the way I just described? where you're looking at a thing with your eyes, but mentally you're giving it to God. I almost see it like this, whoop, a little loop. The icon's right here, my eyes are right here, and I see the icon, and it makes me remember God, and I give my intention to God, right? It's not some sort of mechanism of transference necessarily. It is a mental act, and maybe even like a sort of Platonic abstract metaphysical relation. Now, okay, I'm going to respond to Gavin Ortlund. Gavin Ortlund says that he doubts two things: that the participatory theology of the icon, although I don't think he really uses that term, but that icons are a window into heaven or a window into the divine, right? AKA that icons somehow give you a relationship to the saints in heaven or to divine things, or to God himself, that they're a window into that. And he also doubts that the veneration of an image transfers to its subject, right? The honor given to an image transfers to its subject. Now, look, like I already said in defining an icon, Philaret's definition of an icon and how we venerate it already clearly undercuts the concern that what does it even mean for it to transfer, right? Something like that. It's not that it's a mechanism, right? It's that it's a mental act. Okay. And so that idea of transferring through an icon just makes sense. But I'm going to bar that, and I'm going to just discuss those 2 points through more direct argument, not just appealing to the definition, but I'm going to give examples of why we kind of, if we want to be coherent, if we want to be consistent with our other beliefs, we kind of have to say that the participation relation, the participationist theology of the icon makes sense, and the transfer from the representation to the subject represented makes sense. I'm going to give more direct arguments for that through examples and thought experiments, but I want to bar that just reading St. Philaret of Moscow. I take it that if you can conceive of doing what St. Philaret says, that should be enough to defeat the skepticism of people like Gavin Ortlund or anybody who doesn't know how to venerate an icon. Like, it's just something that should be obvious through through experience that this is possible. I'm taking statistics right now. I'm just constantly talking about experiment. Okay, so let's look at my more direct arguments with that definition of icons in mind and what it is to venerate them. Now, adding a little bit to that again, I'm going to add that, voice crack, I'm going to add that the official position of the Orthodox Church is that icons are participatory, and that in virtue of that participation relationship between the subject and the representation, that there is a transference of honor, what you give, the honor or respect or whatever in veneration that you give to the icon transfers to the subject. Now, to unpack the idea of participation, and this is something I'm not seeing people talk about online, participation is a Platonic concept. To participate in something is typically analyzed as having like two parts. It's to resemble something, and it's not necessarily just visually resemble, but in some sense, there's a lot of different ways you could talk about resembling, right? I resemble myself. The oak tree resembles another oak tree. The diagram of an oak tree resembles a real oak tree and all real oak trees. A written statement describing oak trees resembles an oak tree in some way, right? The representation and resemblance relation, it's hard metaphysically to understand what it is. I'm not going to really get into it. But through just common sense and the way we talk, resemblance makes sense. Okay? Now, classically, that first component of participation, resemblance, in the Christian tradition, in the Christian metaethical tradition, which is the grounding of morality, of good and evil, what everything is meant to do is in its own way. Every creature is in its own way meant to resemble God, to participate in the divine nature. And that is what goodness is. A creature's goodness is the degree to which it resembles God, who is goodness itself, who is beauty itself, who is rationality itself, right? And so we are good, we are beautiful, we are rational insofar as we participate in the divine nature. And part of what that means is we are good, rational, beautiful insofar as we resemble the nature of God in our own way. Every creature is different, and we can't all perfectly resemble God. But, that derives not just from Platonic and Neoplatonic theology and philosophy, but from Jesus' word himself. Be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect, right? So at the core of Christian ethics and metaethics is God is the divine ground of goodness, beauty, rationality, and he is our exemplar or ideal role model, and we are to be like him. And our goodness and beauty and rationality is a measure of how much we resemble or participate in the divine. Got it? So that's the first part of the participation relation. The second participation is cooperation in or synergy in divine activities or the activities of someone else. So you have, static character traits. I am like this thing. I resemble the nature of God. I resemble maybe the divine mind. But there's also the activities of God and the activities of other objects that you can participate in. And when we direct our energies, our activities, and align them with the will of God and his, come on camera, his activities, we essentially jump into his activities and work with him as co-workers, as cooperators, as Paul says. The word for that is synergy, synchronous energies. Think of it that way. And that is the other way we participate. So when Christians, at least theologically and historically educated Christians, talk about the participation relation, they're talking about two things: resemblance to the divine nature, or resemblance to something, and then cooperation or synchronous working with that thing. So in relation to God, you see this in many of the church fathers. I have never found a church father that does not talk like this, frankly. What it is for a human being to be good, or any creature, but let's talk about humans in particular, is to participate in the divine nature and the divine life, the divine energies, the divine activities. Now we participate by becoming the type of people that are like God, becoming generous, kind, loving, just, intelligent. God is all-knowing, all good. Become all good. Become all-knowing. Expand your mind, expand your body, expand everything about you until you are more and more like the divine. And that, if you're Origen or if you're Maximus, that's going to go on to infinity. You're never going to get there, but you're going to get closer and closer and closer to approximating the divine. You're going to increase in your degree of participation, right? Forever. And that's why eternity never gets tiresome or boring. But the other way is you also don't just become the right sort of person internally in your inner being, in your dispositions and thoughts. Your activities are also the type of person. You're not just disposed to generosity, you're also giving generously. You're not just creative, you're also creator. You are creating like God creates. You are, as an artist, a photographer, and a musician, not just a philosopher. I also think of my creative activities as a spiritual process, because I am essentially not only resembling God by bringing new things into being in a rational, orderly way, but I am also, God is giving me certain powers and energies, and I go into this in my photography books, and also some of the other stuff I'm working on. God gives me powers and energies, and I with him in cooperation with the natural world outside of me and bringing new things into being. So me and God are working together to increase the beauty of the world. And I'm participating in God in that way. So it's not just, when I used to teach introductory ethics, I would teach virtue ethics like this. Virtue ethics says that you need to be the right sort of thing and also do the right sort of stuff. So it's not just a matter of who I am, it's also what I do. It's both those things. So to participate in something is to kind of calibrate yourself to be like it and to join in with it in its activities and do the same sort of stuff. So the Christian tradition talks about God like that. I have not seen Gavin Ortlund or anybody else talk about the participation relation in regards to icons. It almost never comes up. And I'm sorry, this is a fundamental part of Christian theology. This is something that you cannot get rid of and be faithful to the words of Christ. As I already said, be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. It's core. So that's what participation is, those two parts. Now, when we say that an icon is participatory, what we mean is that the icon resembles the thing that it represents. It is a sign, and it resembles a signifier in some sense. It doesn't have to look like them. Again, you can have all sorts of weird resemblance participation relations. A horse in Aristotelian and Christian ethics can resemble the divine, right? It's not that God is a horse. It's not that they look exactly alike, right? There's other types of resemblance. An icon resembles its subject, maybe through visual symbolism. Maybe some icons really look like their subject, especially modern saints, like Saint Paisios. Some icons of him are just a picture or a very photorealistic icon. But they in some way resemble that. And also, as a still image, it's not going to be doing an activity, but it can even show and resemble the activities that they were doing in their life, if it's a saint. Or it resembles Christ. If he's holding a cross, if the visual symbolism, like a big forehead, big brain, mega mind, that shows that they're intelligent, right? It shows that it resembles, through visual symbolism, the nature and the activities of the subject, right? Now, when you unpack it like that, clearly an icon can represent Christ or the saints. Why wouldn't it? If we think that a photograph can, why wouldn't an icon be able to? Now you say, well, a photograph is more realistic. Hey, look, as a photographer, I'm telling you, a photograph is not a realistic representation of a thing. I won't even get into that any representation is filtered through whatever represents it, whether it be through the human eye or through a camera lens. But the point is, a photograph, even though it looks like what your eye sees, is not an objective, 1-1 approximation of the thing itself. Come on, camera. Because it's filtered through a lens and a sensor and processing software and then edited, right? If it's a digital camera. There are dissimilarities even there. But the point is, if a photograph can represent something, can participate in its subject, so can an icon. And if you want to debate that, if you want to get into that, you're going to have to take very radical anti-representational stances, metaphysical stances in philosophy. And guess what? The people discussing this stuff are not educated in that. I have read into it. I have looked into it. I would not say I'm competent or an expert in that. But the way we typically talk, I am pretty confident that participation relation between the sign and the thing signified, the signifier and the thing signified, makes sense. Okay? And if you want to debate that, You're going to have to do philosophy. You're going to have to read up on the metaphysical traditions. You're going to actually have to do metaphysics. You're not just going to be able to appeal to history. Okay? It really feels like a lot of people are just bypassing all the hard philosophical and metaphysical work that you have to do in life to come to a conclusion. You're just trying to read everything off of history. And it's very naive. It's also kind of insulting to philosophers. But anyway, so just from unpacking the idea of participation, it really seems to me that icons can be participatory in their subjects. And that is what the church means by a window into heaven. It does not mean literally when you look at an icon, you look through a transparent thing and you see heaven. It does not mean even that when you look at an icon, you are necessarily enraptured and have a mystical experience of the divine. What it means is that it participates in a saint, or it participates in Christ, or it participates in Christ's ministry and activities. I do not see any reason to doubt that without becoming a wildly metaphysically committed nominalist that says these type of relations just don't exist. They're all mental fictions. But even if they were all mental fictions, if God is reality itself, if God is fundamental reality, and God includes in his nature mentality, if some aspect of God is mental, or the ground of mental activity, then the divine ideas, if our ideas approximate the divine ideas themselves, then even if there are no abstract Platonic relationships between things, the divine ideas ground these sort of resemblance and participation relations. And that is actually typically how the church, like Aquinas especially, who I have a lot of respect for, that is typically how the church has defined participation. It's not through just these abstract relationships. It's the divine mind and divine ideas ground these sorts of more abstract immaterial realities. Again, Thomas Aquinas synthesizing the Christian metaethical tradition and giving it a broad theoretical framework essentially says, look, participation isn't between some ideal Platonic idea and the human being. No, it's between the divine ideas, those parts of the divine mind that are identical with the divine nature, and the things that those divine ideas are instances of. So by being good, we participate in the divine idea about our goodness, what God wills for us to be like, and thereby participate in the divine nature. So even if you're going to be a anti-Platonist, you would then also have to be an anti-conceptualist about these sorts of relationships to undercut the entire claim of icons being a window into heaven. I don't think that Ortlund is prepared to do that. I don't think that anybody I've seen online is prepared to delve into those topics. And frankly, I am not prepared to delve into those topics because I am still stuck in the Kantian kind of anti-metaphysical framework. But I'm a pragmatist in the sense that I think that if I can show you from common sense and experience that all my other ways of talking are successful and that I have to continue to talk like this about participation and think like this in order to make those other successful ways of believing and talking consistent, and I don't have any contradiction between them, and it seems to work, then that is enough to kind of, I'm going to keep going with that, right? Until I'm shown something that destroys the system, then I have to update it. That's, I think, at least right now, as good as human beings can do to get at the truth, is a sort of generous pragmatism like C.S. Peirce, who's my favorite philosopher. So, you know, I think I've shown that the idea makes sense, that it's coherent, that with our other ways of talking, participation is coherent, and kind of we have to talk that way unless we want to get into some weird absurdities. Now, that's a participation icons bit. Let me give, well, so there's participation unpacked for icons, what it means for them to be a window into heaven. Now let me talk about the transference thing, which I've already talked about, so I'm going to keep it brief. Veneration or honor or what worship or whatever transfers from the icon to the subject, not through some strange mechanism of, I see this image of Christ, I venerate, because this is Christ, I worship Christ, right? I do the sign of the cross, I bow, I kiss his feet, or I kiss him. I'm not saying, no one is saying, except for the maybe metaphysically naive Orthodox or Catholics, that when I did that, it deposited in the image, and then through some sort of metaphysical mechanism, it was delivered to Christ himself. Maybe something like that could technically be true, but as St. Philaret says, again, it's not that. It's that when you do that, you are intending, through a mental act, you are intending to kiss Christ. You are intending to show worship and honor to Christ. When I do this, I am not worshiping the image. I love the image. I think this image is sacred, even though it's only a print. Okay? I think it's sacred because it has a real relationship, like I said, to Christ, to his activities, to what he did, to who he was. Look at that humble and meek servant. Look at, I know it won't focus, but the love in his eyes as he suffers. Look at, it's beautiful. Him rescuing us from death. There's Adam's skull. And then there's two little men in black. I don't know what those mean. I don't know what these little midgets are here. But anyway, but Christ himself, look, I know when I venerate this, which I just did on camera for you to see a live example of, I know that I'm not worshiping this image. I'm not worshiping the matter. I'm not even worshiping the abstract image. I am worshiping Christ. Okay? It is not that I am depositing it in here and then it transfers to the divine. But that's how people like Gavin Ortlund talk about this. That's how people talk about this. And it does not make sense to me. So, now that I've covered both parts of icon veneration, participation and transference, or transfer of honor, I want to give a couple direct arguments. Or examples that, like I said before, if you grant these examples, and yet you don't grant the participation claim of the icons, and the transfer claim of the icons, if you don't think that makes sense, then you are being wildly inconsistent. And that is pretty much with metaphysics, I think, the best we can do a lot of the times, right? So here's my first argument. I'm going to start from the holiest and then eventually get into some maybe not so good stuff that might be a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, but I'm going to talk about them because it's important and will really drive the point home. My method of arguing is a lot like St. John of Damascus. I'm not going to just recapitulate his arguments completely, but I think you should all go read his short treatises on icon veneration. They're free online, ccel.org. I'm going to kind of argue a lot in that vein, but I'm going to expand them to be more contemporary. So the first one would be mental images and memories of Christ. Again, I want to talk about Christ and not the saints. You know, it's going to be another topic for another day, whether it's okay to venerate saints. I take it for granted that, yes, it's fine, because if the apostles were here with me, if the other saints were here with me, I'd bow to them. I'd kiss them on the hand. I'd give them a big hug. I'd say, I love you guys. You guys are my good friends. My patron saint is Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory the theologian. I have an icon of him. Whenever I see that icon, I think, oh, my friend, one day I long to be in the new heavens and new earth with you and just have a good conversation with you. And guess what? I'm gonna give that guy a big fat hug. I'm gonna kiss his hand. I'm gonna say thank you for all of the work that you did. Thank you for the writings. Thank you for showing me Christ. I respect you. You are so much smarter than I was in this life. Can I learn from you? Can we be friends? Right? Just like now, my priest, who is not a canonized saint, every time I see my priest, I bow and I kiss his hand. It's not worship. It's a sign of respect. So I don't take that as a problem, but if you really want to argue that, we'd have to do a lot more. So I'm just going to take that as granted. I'm going to take it that if I could show that it's okay to actually worship God through an icon, then it's okay to venerate a saint through an icon. I'm just going to take that for granted. Now, a mental image of Christ. Let's say that the apostles know Christ in their lifetime, and then Christ dies, resurrects, ascends, and leaves them. And they have a vivid memory of Christ, a mental image. Now, if thinking about that image, if they think about it and are moved as they think about it, and they drop down and worship and do the sign of the cross. I know they probably didn't do the sign of the cross back then. But if they did that and it said, oh God, as they're thinking about the image, as it's in their mind, oh God, oh Christ, oh my Lord, I love you so much. Please be with me. I cannot wait to be fully reunited with you. My great love, my sweet love, the Son of God. Right? And maybe even blowing a mental or physical kiss at the image. Is that idolatry? Is that improper? Now, the mental image, the memory of Christ is not Christ. It is a mental representation of Christ. And, as part of mental events, memory and visible images are probably rooted in the brain. It is probably some sort of strange neurological, maybe there's, dualism mind going on, that type of stuff. I'm not an expert in philosophy of mind. But it is a brain representation of Christ. Is that representation holy? I would say so. Is that memory sacred? Yes, I would say so. Is it wrong to venerate it like I just did? Is it wrong to worship Christ while with my mind's eye focused on the image, I am giving that attention to Christ because I know what it represents? I don't think that's wrong. I think that's actually obligatory. If you didn't do that and you had if you had a memory or mental image of Christ of how he really was and you didn't do that whenever you remembered it, I'd be like, do you really respect him? Right? I think that'd be obligatory. Does that mental image participate in Christ? And that it resembles him and in his activities? Yeah, clearly. Right? So right there you have veneration is okay. The transference claim makes sense and is okay. And the participation relation makes sense and is okay. Through a memory or mental image. Now that also applies, I think St. John of Damascus actually gives this argument. I might be wrong. That applies during Christ's life, even if he's standing in front of you. Guess what, guys? The world is mediated through our sense organs, through the filters of our brain. When we see somebody in front of us, we're not really seeing what they really are. It's a representation. So even if it's not a memory, it's still a mental image when he's in front of us, and the same comments are going to apply. Okay? Now, if mental images, memories, and representations of the mind are okay, if they participate and worship of them transfers in the way I described, and if that's okay, then why would an icon not? Inherently, why would an icon not? Now, I don't want to get into the extrinsic or instrumental thing of it's a slippery slope. Icons lead people to idolatry. That's a different argument. But I'm saying inherently, what would be wrong about an image doing that? Okay, example number 2. Say Paul is going down the road and Christ appears to him in a vision. Now, whether that's a vision and he actually appears and everybody could see it if they were there looking, or if it's just a mental vision of Christ, Paul falls on his knees and says, oh my God, you are real. Christ, you are the Messiah. And he venerates and worships Christ through that vision. Was that wrong? That vision participates in Christ, surely, right? And the vision also, as Paul, his mind's eye or his literal eye is fixed on Christ in that appearance or vision. He is mentally giving that worship and veneration and honor. and allegiance to Christ, right? Is that wrong? So unless we want to say that Paul's vision that converted him was wrong, I think we have to admit that worshiping Christ through an image is okay. The participation relationship holds here in the vision, and the transference claim works here too, holds here, right? Now, again, what is the difference between an icon and that? Now, I know there are differences between an icon and that. Like, that's probably a better representation. The vision's a better representation. The vision's more profound, is more closely participating in Christ, or it might be Christ himself mediated through our visual and sensory apparatus. But fundamentally, what is the, you have to point out a difference to where one is right and the other's wrong, inherently. No one's done that. And I don't see how you could. Okay. Another one. Let's say that somehow we went back in time, or the apostles somehow invented a camera and they captured an image of Christ, a photograph. And so we had a photo of Jesus. Now, if that photograph was widely distributed and reproduced, and we all had one in our church, would it be wrong to bow down and venerate it? Now, again, surely that participation relationship holds, right? We all think about photos as resembling, as truly signifying. So surely that participation relationship holds. And I would say you have to be daft to think that, come on, camera, to think that it doesn't transfer. So what's the difference between a painting and the photograph, other than degree of representation and fidelity, right? Other than degree. Hello, camera. Hello. I need a new camera. I really do need a new camera. Maybe it's this light. So again, unless you want to show there's some fundamental difference between a photo of Christ and an icon of Christ, you're going to have to get on board. And to do that, again, philosophical speculation, metaphysics, which you're not prepared to do, anybody. Sorry. This is the problem with modern theological education, is that it does not train you in the actual theological traditions and metaphysical traditions, the philosophical traditions. It focuses on reading a bunch of historical sources and not actually doing theology like the fathers did. The problem with my philosophical education was that it didn't do anything else other than just the reasoning part. I read some good texts, but I read barely anything through grad school. It was all very technical. There needs to be a balance. YouTubers online, they're way off balance, all historical. Me, way off balance, all abstract, all philosophical. And that's why I didn't do a PhD, because I'm trying to recalibrate myself that way. Hello? Oh my God, this camera. Okay, next example. Let's get one more of Christ. Okay. During Christ's life on earth, the apostles go and they see a mirror. Mirrors weren't widely available back then. They were expensive, right? But let's say they're in a pool of water, or they're in a rich person's house and they see a mirror. They see Christ through the mirror. And let's say I walk into a party that Jesus is at, and I see Jesus through the mirror, and before even seeing him, I go, "Oh, my Lord. Bless you. Oh, my Lord, so good to see you." I bow. And I love him through that. Is that wrong? Participates, clearly. It's a reflection of him. Remember that participation is resemblance. Another way to put resemblance is reflection, right? So the participation claim holds there. And is that wrong to transfer the honor through that? And it makes sense the transference claim holds. So I can't see a problem there. Okay. Now, would it be better to turn to Christ and actually do it? Sure. If he was right there. But is that wrong? Don't think so. And the theological claims hold of participation and transfer. Okay, now getting away from Christ himself. We talk this way about people too. Let's say you have a photo of a loved one. Let's say my wife dies and I have a photo of her. And I'm going to be crude now. Is it okay for me to just piss all over that? Or to let someone piss on it? Or let my dog chew it? Wouldn't that, in some sense, wouldn't I feel that violates the memory of my wife? That shows her dishonor through doing that to her image? Now, unless I want to deny that and say anything goes, then I have to essentially say that even in an image of a loved one like that, not even of a saint, just of my late wife, if I show it disrespect like that, it transfers to the subject in some sense. I don't know how you're going to deny that. I'm sorry. I don't know how you're going to deny it. You could by becoming a nominalist, but again, even somebody who grounds abstract, non-physical relationships with the divine ideas is able to say that. Okay. So in that, clearly a photograph of my wife, the participation relation holds, and clearly the transfer relation holds. And I don't see that I think it would be wrong to disrespect it, and that shows the transfer relationship holds. And I also think that it would be absolutely, totally fine for me to take that image, and maybe even while I'm praying to God, I have that image by me, and I say, Lord, rest the soul of my wife. And maybe I can even speak to my wife. Is this wrong to look at my wife and go, honey, whatever state you're in, pray for me. And I pray for you, and I love you, and I miss you, and I kiss the image of my wife. Is that wrong? The transfer relationship, I think, clearly holds there, right? It's not that I'm worshiping the image. It's not that I'm respecting or honoring just the image. I'm doing it because I know it's a representation of my wife, because it participates in my wife, right? So unless we want to deny that, then I don't see why we would deny. You'd have to show some fundamental inherent difference between an icon and that, between an image and a painting and that. And unless you want to get deep into the metaphysics and philosophy of art, good luck. Okay. Now, this is the final one, and this one's the crudest, and I want to really let this hit home because all of these evangelical pastors are so big on this. I know this from experience. Okay? Porn and lust. What Protestant, especially evangelical pastor, is going to tell you that when you masturbate or lust and look at porn and have lust in your heart, that you are not lusting after the people in it? That is clearly another example of how the honor or dishonor, the desire or lust or love or attraction of towards the representation transfers to the object. Okay? Unless we want to deny that about videos and images that are pornographic, then I do not know, how we could deny that about icons. So, when I watch porn or when I lust after someone, it's that same thing. Yeah, the images participate in that they reflect and resemble the people and the activities, the bad sexual activities they're doing. When I have attraction in my heart towards that, when I look at that and lust after it, when I crave it, when I desire it, when I move towards it, I'm not just doing it towards the image. I'm doing it towards the subject. I would much rather be there, right? And again, I'm getting crude. I'd much rather be there in the porno than just looking at the video, right? It's not about the video. The video is just an instrument because I can't be there. It's a medium, right? The thing I'm really attracted to, the thing I'm really expressing lust towards is the subjects and what they're doing, right? And I'm sure most people in our culture will be familiar with that. If you want to deny that the transfer relationship and the participation relationship hold there, good luck. Again, have fun with metaphysics. You need to go do a PhD in philosophy. You'll be there for several years just focusing on that sort of thing. What's the difference between that and icon, other than that one is holy, one is not? Other than that, one is a positive transfer and a positive participation, and one is a negative bad thing. What's the difference? So again, like I said, at least in my view of metaphysics, the best I can do right now is to kind of show you that our ordinary ways of talking and our ways of talking and thinking that are shaped by deep reflection through a process of reflective equilibrium, through a process of refining and being careful, through a process of investigating. If the ways we think and talk and slice up and conceptualize the world that are successful require us to also apply it to something else to be consistent, then we should be consistent like that. Now, all of these examples, mental images and memories of Christ, Christ through a mirror, a photo of Christ, a vision of Christ, a photo of a loved one, and pornographic images and videos. All of these, the participation relationship holds, and at least in our common way of talking about it and thinking about it, we could see that it holds, and the transfer relationship holds. Now, if those hold for those, why wouldn't it hold for an icon? The other part of that is they are rightful. It is right or wrong in the case of the porn, but it is right to engage in acts of respect or even worship when it's Christ or God through those images, through those participatory representations, because it transfers. So the theology, the metaphysics of the icon holds for all these other objects, and it's okay to do it for these other objects. What is the difference inherently between a painting or a statue and those? Good luck showing me the difference, everybody. Not to be a jerk, but good luck showing me the difference. Now, someone might want to object here. So that concludes my actual direct arguments for the theology of the icon, to show that it is metaphysically plausible and that it is fine in those examples. Now, someone may object, again, that, well, okay, I grant that, but maybe we shouldn't do it in our churches. It shouldn't be liturgical. Why? Well, is it just because you think there's a slippery slope? If you encourage people to do this, they'll get into idolatry? I could say that about everything else. Instruments in church, contemporary music in church, having pastors who are not part of a strictly authoritative hierarchy, and so have considerable freedom on what to teach and how to treat their flock. All of these things can be abused. Why should the abuse determine the proper use? You have to make a stronger argument than just raising the possibility of a slippery slope. So again, I don't think that's a plausible argument. The other thing that I've mentioned is, look, we're children of the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment. None of us believe in the old gods. There's a couple, of these white, new agey, young 20-something-year-old girls that like crystals, okay, that want to pretend they're pagan because it's the newest trend in consumerism. Even they are not pagans. They don't really believe that Zeus exists, and if they do, they're the exception to the rule, right? Yeah. I don't think that we really, in our culture, that many of us have a tendency towards real idolatry, towards worshiping a false god that would be triggered by icon veneration. Especially since the subject of the icons are saints, angels, who are also saints, and God himself incarnate in Christ. You've already got there, that's not going to dispose you to worshiping false gods or honoring false deities. But you've also got there, I don't think that in the background of our minds, we are going to all of a sudden be like, well, it's okay to do this with Christ. Maybe I could do this with Zeus. Maybe I could do this with Hermes. So the slippery slope argument, you'd really have to get creative there to actually have me take it seriously. So again, Gavin Ortlund as the prime example, not to pick on him too much, but as a prime example of a popular YouTuber that is arguing against icons, his two doubts of participation and transfer, I think I've defeated those. I think I've shown you that why should you doubt that and not doubt all these other things? The other thing would be his arguments, his extrinsic arguments about a slippery slope, I just don't think are very convincing for reasons I just mentioned. So what's the problem with icons? It seems like, from my reasoning, from this direct philosophical sort of reasoning, icon veneration makes sense. I don't see a prohibition of it in the Bible. I see a prohibition of worshiping false gods for sure, but I don't see any clear-cut prohibition against venerating an icon like this. I see it in the fathers. I think Gavin Ortlund's right that historically some of the fathers were an-iconic or iconoclasts. I think he's right about that. But do they have supreme authority? Do they have authority over the ecumenical councils? Do they have authority over the life and practices of the church? Do they have authority over the later fathers and theologians? Do they have authority over my reasoning that I think is very compelling? What degree? And again, is he going to give them that authority? Doubt it. So again, I think the case against icons is just extremely weak, and it depends on giving historical sources too much weight and focusing too much on doing reconstructive historical theology. There's also other ways to think and reason. Okay, that's it for the video. 1 hour and 8 minutes is what I'm showing on this. So sorry it was so long, but I hope that these thoughts have been helpful. And I hope this is the last thing I ever have to make on icons, because I would rather just keep venerating them and practicing what I practice that has brought me spiritual life and growth, instead of constantly talking about it. I think we all need to take my advice and shut up. Not to be a jerk, but God, come on, everybody. There's a time to speak and a time to shut your mouth. And if you don't want to constantly have arguments going, just stop talking. Everybody just be quiet. Please. Everybody just needs to start being more quiet. I know that might sound weird, but man, read Gregory's first theological oration. Read the opening 2 paragraphs of that. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Hope this was helpful. Cheers.